Thank you for listening to the Unscripted Dreams Podcast with Joe and Marcus. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email us at unscripteddreams@gmail.com. If you're interested in listening to exclusive content that includes bonus episodes and our hindsight video series, please join us on Patreon at the Unscripted Dreams Podcast. If you're listening to our podcast on YouTube, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, or iHeartRadio. Thank you.
As we know, life is full of surprises, both good and bad. The day-to-day journey is full of unforeseen obstacles, and sometimes it's hard to see our way through. Beyond the norm and mundane are where unscripted dreams live. Join us for thought-provoking discussions and interviews to help us navigate through the fog and create our own path. We are the Unscripted Dream Podcast, operating outside the margins to motivate and inspire our audience. So today's episode is about on to the next. And to give you a quick definition of what that term means or statement means, on to the next, is simply, it's more or less self-explanatory, but for people that don't understand the terminology or the lingo, it's basically transitioning to something new, something different. How do you move on to the next project, the next task, the next step in your professionalism, the next situation, relationship, whatever, on to the next.
Yeah. So moving on to the next, the first thing that comes to my mind is just really cutting your losses. For me, and I think that's something that's important that, we kind of take inventory of, and, because, there's a time when it's, it's time to move on. Like you were saying, Joe, just kind of like, it's time to move on to something else. I mean, some things just, they expire and it's time to, it's time to get out of there and move on to, move on to something else. And that I think that is something that is challenging for a lot of people, just because with moving on and with cutting your losses, I mean, when you take into account the amount of like the time, maybe the money, maybe the resources that have went into that, it's not as easy to, cut the cord on something that you've invested so much into.
Right. I mean, I agree. Like when you think about it, think about, how many times you've been stubborn or unwilling to let go. And you figure out later that by you not willing to move on or move on to the next phase of your life, it typically leads to, you perpetually being dissatisfied with everything. It just leads even more to your unhappiness because you didn't let that phase of your life to properly, not necessarily die, but you didn't care to leave it alone because, you tried to ride that thing out. And sometimes you kind of have to let certain things go so you can actually appreciate things more. It's all part of your development as a individual.
Yeah. So, Joe, the concept of like cutting your losses, there's a concept. It's usually an economic concept, but it's called a sunk cost fallacy. So this is, I mean, like I said, primarily used in economics, but it's just the concept of, knowing when it's time to fold, like knowing when it's time to fold. And it's common, like in the stock market. I know, Joe, you invest. I mean, I invest as well. I've kind of let the foot off the gas a little bit, but it's similar to like, if and I'm guilty of this. Like I'll buy a stock and then I'll kind of like, I'm watching it probably more than what I should be watching it. And then you'll see that stock, it'll start to dip. And then you have to make a decision as an investor. You have to make a decision if that price starts to dip, if you're looking at all the factors in the market that could be playing into it. I mean, this happens to almost everybody who's invested, if not all people that have invested in something in the stock market, you see that price go down, and you're hoping that at some point there's going to be some catalyst that makes that stock jump back up to its original price.
Right.
But at some point, and I've lost money with this in the stock market, is that like sometimes that stock is dropping and you have to get out. Like whatever position you're in, you have to let that, like you have to sell just so you can, live to fight another day. Some people, what you'll find is that some people they'll let that stock drop, and then they'll just keep hoping and hoping and hoping that it's going to come back up to its original levels, and it never does. And then by the time everything is said and done, they lost more than what they put into it. And that happens every day.
And one of the applications I actually use, because I actually attack the stock market from different avenues. So say I have a Fidelity account. I'm telling my business on here, but say I got a Fidelity account, a Robinhood account, a Stash account, and an Acorns account, and another account I'm not going to mention. But say that I have all these 5 accounts, right? The reason why I may or may not put too much value on them is because the money that I put into them are spread it out. So none of those accounts are touching each other. And what I mean by that is each account has money invested in different areas of the stock market. So that's one way how I wanted to attack certain things. But it's also play money too. Instead of me buying t-shirts and shoes all the time and stuff like that, hip hop stuff, not urban wear, but hip hop stuff, that kind of stuff. I decided to do things like that to see if I can actually, increase my income a little bit. I wasn't expecting to make big gains. So the money I have in these accounts is not enough to really go boo-hoo or cry over, but it's definitely enough for me to be like, hey, dude, you should probably start taking a look at the background of the company, the status of the company, and all these certain things, and research that. Because every time I do see something that keeps going down, 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 all it does is empowers me to actually go out and visibly Google search immediately, go into a huge Google deep dive. I've even watched YouTube videos about companies tanking, and they'll tell you, sometimes you'll find some valuable information in there, and then sometimes you'll find some scamming information in there too, to kind of sway your opinion about things. And you kind of have to read in between the lines. But what you're saying, Marcus, is true. You have to make a decision on whether you want to, pull back and take what's left over, or do you really want to keep up with it? I say that I don't have enough vested to the point where I feel like I'm gonna lose sleep over it. But best believe if it was something that was really serious, if any of that stuff was touching my savings account or something like that, bro, I would be, I probably would have a heart attack. So, more or less, I get what you're saying, man. Maybe it's more relatable if I talk about gambling, from a casino standpoint, because I do occasionally go to the casino and I actually play on the table. But the thing is, I have a ruling. I have anticipated how much money I'm willing to lose every time I go in there. Not everybody has that, because not everybody's financially responsible, right? I intentionally have this money that I've paid myself, I'm going to a Chuck E. Cheese arcade and be like, this is all you got. And that way, you're not going to lose all your money. You just, either you come out with something or you're done. Considering I don't live too far from a casino, if I do go, I usually put no more than 100 down. So I usually split it up however I'm feeling, and I would either be on the crap table, or I'll be on the roulette, or I'll be on the slots. And, you know, some days you have lucky nights and other days you don't. But, you know, I usually just go for the experience, you know, my night out to myself. But that's neither here nor there. Like, you have to have some type of control or structure over what you're doing at all times. Otherwise, you're just going to lose yourself. And that's a perfect example right there.
Yeah. Well, gambling is the stock market is gambling. So that's funny that you tied those in together, but they're the same essentially. The stock market, you can make some more educated decisions.
Yeah, one's more legal, I guess.
So, but anyway, before we end up making the episode entirely about the stock market, we'll transition into something else. So, as I continue just on just the concept of just a sunk cost fallacy, another example, this is a more basic example of like knowing when to cut your losses. So I think we've all done this. Like, you're watching a bad movie. Maybe you spent money on it. Maybe you didn't. But do you keep watching this movie after you get 30 minutes in and you're like, man, this movie's trash?
No chance.
So, some people, it's like, well, I've already invested 30 minutes. Or you go to the movies and you feel like, well, I spent my money on this ticket, so I'm going to go ahead and watch it, even though you're not enjoying yourself and it's just maybe a trash movie. Like, I've walked out of movies before, even though I spent my money. It's like, well, I got to cut my losses and, just move on to something else. Maybe I go pay and see another movie, or something like that. But that's more so like a basic, like a lower level example of like taking inventory of what's going on, and just like everything, like just because you invested a certain amount of money in something, doesn't mean that, you can still walk away.
Yep.
From something. But like I said, the example of a movie is that just, I know we've all watched something and you just kind of like, what am I watching? And then you have to make a decision to continue watching it or not. Like I said, that's happened to us all, I think.
Yeah, I just fall asleep usually.
All right, so Joe takes the time to catch up, get some rest, make the most out of it. But that brings me to another issue, is that just because you invested money in something doesn't mean that you have to stick with it. And there's an example that I have from when I didn't waste money, but I did lose some money. But there's a while ago, I was looking back through my invoices because I was getting ready for this, and I was thinking about, it's a couple years ago. I had an interest in doing some work with affiliate marketing, and I was looking at like the Amazon affiliate, ClickBank, things like that. And as I was doing my research, I was like, well, the intent was because I was trying to increase, my revenue stream. I was trying to get, my money coming in a second, another way. So
right.
I was like, well, if I can, like I did some research. This 2 years ago, so I'm a lot more thorough now. But, I did my research and I said, if I do this, this will allow me to, have additional income and all of this, all of these things. So, I spent upwards of, as I went through these invoices, I spent upwards of $600 getting a website set up, working on logos and banners for the website, working on sending traffic to the website, which was bots at the time. And now I have a much greater understanding of bots and things like that. But that was just a learning experience. But anyway, like I said, 2 years ago, I spent all this money getting all these things done. And I ended up just kind of like, I had to make a decision to let it go. I was also working on my first, like my ebook at the time too, for my business. And at the time, I just kind of, as things were happening, and then I left my one job at the time. I took a $10,000 pay cut because I was working at this college and I wasn't having that, what they were doing to people. I've talked about that in the past, but anyway, I didn't have the resources to do all of these things anymore. And I had to make a decision whether I was going to stick with it, you know, and continue on that path and doing all this stuff like WordPress and trying to figure out all this stuff with the websites, like extremely time consuming process. And I didn't have as much interest in it as I thought I did initially. And then it was, of course, costing me money to upkeep the websites, buy the domain, all these other things, these like small details that I didn't know. Like sometimes you have to go into something to kind of figure out everything that's involved.
Yep.
And, you know, and I had to make a decision. Like, I'm just going to have to after I invested this money, so I'm just going to have to let this go and put focus back into like my business and just like put all that energy in there. And just like, I made an attempt to do something that didn't work out. You know, I could keep holding on to it or I can move on. And that's, you know, like we say, like just charging that, like I just had to charge that to the game. And Joe, I think you have a good explanation of this. Can you explain to people what that phrase means? Charge that to the game.
If you see no way out, or you see the goal or designation of where you're trying to be unattainable or unachievable, you at that point realize that it's probably best for you to call it quits. And that's where we get the whole term from, called charge it to the game. Because you're playing the game, you're trying to stay on top, you're trying to win, right? And then you find out that you got into this level where you're trapped into a corner and you only got one life left. Game over, right? So you got to charge it to the game, man. You know, either you find another avenue how to beat that level, or you just call it quits and play another game.
Yeah, man. Thanks for breaking that down, Joe. I appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. No problem.
So have you ever had a situation like similar to that, or something that like that's happened to you?
I deal with that daily, to be honest with you. Well, maybe not daily. That sounds ridiculous, but more often than not. I can't really think of anything verbatim off the top of my head, but there has been situations where I just exerted all options. And, you know, at one point, it just got to a point where if you can't beat them, join them, or, you know, call it quits. And, you know, you get to that when you get tired, flustered, you know, when it starts playing on your mental, you know, that's when you kind of have to get out of there. You know, once you're no longer performing at the level that you should be doing, that's when you want to move on to the next. Because when you're doing all of these things that are unattainable, you know, at that point, you're wasting your energy. So what happens is your physical health decreases, your mental health decreases, and typically you start disengaging. And, you know, with these impossible goals, you start feeling like stressed. So you start showing symptoms of, who knows, depression. I don't know, you're having intrusive thoughts, and, you know, maybe you're losing sleep. I don't know, whatever the case is, but eventually it develops into more physical issues because it's weighing on your brain, your body. When you go into stress, your body breaks down. So when you start stressing about something, notice that your digestive system doesn't work the same. You usually go hours and days without eating, or you might have headache, or you might even break out in hives or something. You know, like everybody's body works differently or operates differently, but those are the type of indications where you need to call it quits. So if you're in a situation that's doing you like that, like when I was in that situation where I was working for that contractual job, and I noticed that I started feeling pain, just like random pain in my abdomen. You know, I was like, oh no, I got an ulcer. I didn't have an ulcer, but it was like one of those situations right then and there. I was like, okay, I know I don't belong here no more because my health is deteriorating. So when you get to that point, man, or you might just start thinking crazy thoughts, or you're doing anything that's out of your character or your norm, that's when you got to charge it to the game and just move on.
Yeah, Joe, you make a good point. I mean, stress will poke its head out, and stress will, it'll have effects like you were saying, Joe, on you, physically and mentally. And it's important. It's key to understand that, you might see some things because of the stress that you've never seen before. Like something that has never happened to you before will happen. And you have to be able to associate that with whatever you have going on, whatever stressor you may be dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
And, so that's it's like you said, it's happened to you. It's happened to me as well. And you have to be able to figure out, why is this thing happening? That's not, this has never happened before. And, you have to go in there and find the root cause of that issue. And, you have to either figure out how to work through it, or you have to relieve yourself of whatever is causing you that stress. But you have to take the time to really think about what's going on, and not just like sometimes you're really having like a legitimate health issue, but sometimes stress is a mixed bag. It can bring out things things you've never seen before. And you can at times be kind of confused about what's going on. So you have to really be mindful of what you're dealing with, and you have to acknowledge your stress. I think and that's important when cutting your losses, because you need to know where your stress is coming from.
Perfect example is what you see going on in the world right now, where the public is outlashing. Now, we may not have any control over your internal dealings and your personal biases, or however you may see fit. We don't have control over that. Only you do. So when that starts to come out, you don't think those people are under stress? You don't think those people are dealing with some type of issue that they can't control? So the best thing that they can do is kind of outlash, as if that's their way of trying to maintain control. That's kind of why you see these kind of situations. I'm not going to get political, but I'm just saying that plays a factor into what we're talking about today. Like, if you have no way out, or if you can't necessarily find your own path and it's blocked, what are you going to do? You're probably going to raise hell, and you're probably going to give it your best shot, as far as, or at least what you think is your best shot, to eliminate that and make it go away. And when it's still there, then you outlash even more and do unfavorable things. And that's kind of what we see what's going on across the board right now, unfortunately, because people don't know how to react. When you lose your job, when you lose your prized possessions, all of that, your ego's been bruised. All that comes out because you have no control over it.
Yeah. And that turns into, Joe, like, what happens when you find yourself in a place you've never been before? The stress that's associated with that. You find yourself in a strange place, and it's hard for a lot of people. It's hard to navigate yourself out of that, because you're dealing with something entirely new issue that you've never even prepared. Most people have never even prepared for. So, people don't know, like, you don't know really how to deal with that, but I think you have to put the time into, really understanding, like, why you're having these urges to do these certain things, and why that frustration is building inside you at a certain level. And, you have to make a decision as to what's, the smart thing to do versus what's the impulse. Like, you have to fight your own impulses, and that's hard.
I'll tell you one thing: running to the quickest or the nearest liquor store ain't gonna help, and calling up the weed man's definitely not gonna help either, because your pain and your stress is gonna be the same thing with or without it. So if you can't manage it without it, try. I'm not condoning it, but I guess you can try that. But I'm just letting you know that your results aren't necessarily going to improve because you're under the influence. So, you got to find better outlets. You're stronger than that. So you have to realize that for yourself.
Yeah. So, Joe, one of the last things I'm gonna jump into here is that one of the big things with just knowing when to move on and knowing when to cut your losses is understanding. Well, there's a couple of things, but one is just understanding the value of time. Now, time is a resource that you cannot get back. Once you use it, it is gone. So you have to understand that, your time is valuable, and the time that you give to other people, we have to be cognizant of, that time. And, think about if you spend X amount of hours, if you're spending 16 hours working on something that you no longer have an interest in, that has consumed all your energy, all your money, and it's of course taking up all your time, what are you doing? Still doing that? Is it time to move on? Or do you understand that you can't get all that time you put into something that you can't get it back? Like if you spend $1,000 on some sort of course or some sort of, software or item that you buy and it doesn't work and you cannot get there's no way you can get your money back. You have to make a decision that for the sake of your own time, that, you have to move on. And I think each of us individually have to make a decision. We all have to create a value for our time.
Right.
Because a lot of us, we work jobs, we're not happy with what we make, but you've entered an agreement to give up your time for X amount of dollars. So, we all have to consider, what deal did you make with whoever you work for? What deal did you make with whatever activity or commitment that you made that you're giving up this amount of time, because you cannot get your time back once it's gone. So, I think that's something we should all think about. And just because if you're in a situation right now and you're thinking you're looking at your time, you're like, yeah, I'm working this undesirable job for X amount of dollars an hour, then you have to do something on your end to increase what someone is willing to compensate you for the time that you have to give. But you have to have enough. I think you really have to have enough respect for yourself to understand that you're going to put a premium on the time that you have, and you're not just going to give it to anybody. Even if you take a job and you work for less money, you make sure that you're going to work for less money and you're going to get that time to somebody who's deserving rather than someone who's just going to using you,
True.
So that's, and I think I'm going to close on that. Just really understand the value of time, because you can't get it back. You can't buy it. It's really a finite resource. So, for each of us. So, please think about that when it comes to cutting your losses and knowing when to get out of something. Really take the time to consider just that time and the cost of that.
Well, I think Marcus touched on the most important piece of this whole episode, which is time. And so I think the next part that you should focus on is the person that, you need to think about yourself. The only person that really can decide with any certainty when it's the right time to throw in the towel or quote unquote charge it to the game is you. Someone can tell you so many situations of how their situation is similar to yours, and there could be one micro detail that makes it irrelevant. So what I'm saying is ultimately nobody is living the same life you're living, no matter what circumstance or situations they've been through, even if they were the same. the outcomes are going to be different because you're a different person and they're a different person. So you have to keep that in mind. So it's cool to take advice from people. It's also great to have people like a huge support system, but they also can put you in a bigger hole than where you are. Trust me, I know. So what I'm saying is only you can really make the full determination of when is the right time to move on to the next thing. So that's the best thing I can give you.
All right. Well, Joe, if that was your close, I've already closed this thing out. So
yeah,
I hope we got some stuff. We got some stuff for hindsight on this. I have some more stuff I want to ask Joe too. Some other things I wanted to get into. I have some embarrassing stories I'm gonna share about time, so I'm gonna jump into those. but thanks for listening, and take care. Be safe.
Yep, and don't forget to subscribe to our Patreon if you really want to dive deep or take a deep dive into the content we share. So thank you for listening.
All right, peace.
Later.